I need the mic? Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm Yvonne. Initially I thought no pressure, I'm nervous, I'm scared. And then I saw my ASYE assessors and mentors, Yvonne, Gemma, and Donna. So now you really have to keep hard so that I can fulfill PCF 9. Okay, so I'm currently doing my SYE. I've been in my current role for 8 months. I graduated with an MA in social work in Coventry in 2016, and then I took a year to have my first child. I did my first placement with Coventry City Council at a parenting assessment team, and my last placement with Warwickshire County Council Youth Justice Service, which is where I'm working now. And that is that placement that sort of motivated me to write that essay. I don't know how it won the prize. My partner says it's only because there were 2 submitted and one was... he said one was probably an astrophysics essay submitted to the wrong website, and yours, so you won, babe. So, anyways, I'm just going to talk to you about what I do in my everyday role. I'll be reading. I'm very nervous. Bear with me. There is an African proverb that goes, "The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth." And in a nutshell, that is what I do in my everyday professional life as a social worker, working with children that certainly do not feel the warmth of their communities. As a youth justice social worker, I work with children between the ages of 10 and 18 who have committed offenses or are on the verge of doing so. My caseload includes working with children who have committed sexual offenses, burglaries, assaults, carried weapons, arson, criminal damage, racial assault, and motoring offenses. Emotionally, that is very hard. Generally, it's hard to find a social worker that will tell you otherwise about their role. Indeed, that is the main conversation in social work offices, comparing emotionally draining cases that eat away at our souls at night and make us cry in supervision. What makes my role a little bit harder, though, is accompanying a child who has committed 1 burglary too many to custody, after reading how they were placed on a child protection register at the age of 2 for physical, sexual, and emotional neglect, having been born addicted to heroin, transferred through birth, and have been to 16 different foster placements in a space of 6 years. This is the side that the world does not get to see or hear, when the Sun and Mail Online carry headlines that create moral panics. I've got a few headlines here from the Sun and Mail. Stephen and Ghana, I swear I don't read the Mail Online, it's purely for research purposes. Just research purposes.
You should with a critical eye.
Okay, so some of the headlines you see are 1 in 4 adolescents is a criminal, youth crime soars in the last 5 years as gang culture takes grip, British youths are the most unpleasant and violent in the world, save the British nation from young monsters, the rise of child monsters in Britain. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying offending children should not be punished or rehabilitated. What I'm saying is the balance between welfare and justice is so precarious, especially when working with children who have been dealt a bad hand, in most cases in the moment they took their first breaths. Of course it's hard, it's supposed to be hard. If it was easy, everyone would do it. Hard is what makes it great. That is the moment that youth justice social workers get to shine in their roles, writing reports that capture all the circumstances and dynamics affecting child offenders and how this contributes to offenses in question, balancing out sentencing proposals against risk to the wider community, and ensuring that the child's welfare and needs are paramount even in the most punitive settings our land has to offer. It is truly a rewarding role, working with these children and doing therapeutic work with them to address their attachment issues, addressing the underlying issues that trigger offending, giving them some hope, letting them know that their history should not determine their future, building trusting relationships with them as they work on their community orders, which range from anywhere between 3 months and 2 years. They can be the cheekiest, funniest, and intelligent children ever. For example, I've been called old and asked not to sing along to Men Is Not Hot, as it was bare cringe. Because I drove a group of 15-year-old boys to an allotment. The multi-agency culture embraced in youth justice teams is groundbreaking, to say the least. And in my opinion, this is something the field of social work as a whole could benefit from. In my office, for example, I sit alongside a police officer, an adolescent mental health practitioner, an education psychologist, and a substance misuse worker and a victim's advocate. To get the details I need for a child who has just been allocated to me from out of area on the police database, I simply have to walk over to my police officer colleague across the room. Equally, to get the mental health history of a child I've just been allocated, I also simply have to turn my chair and talk to my mental health practitioner sat next to me. Bypassing weeks of putting in a referral to CAMS or the police and waiting for at least 8 weeks to get a response. Organizational barriers are really a myth when professionals work together like this. And most importantly, the beneficiaries of this effective partnership are the children we work with. We work with some of the most vulnerable and challenging young people in the region, and the least they deserve is a comprehensive package of support. They deserve services in which different professionals talk to one another. They deserve support in which interventions aren't duplicated or were still left out. Underneath the tough persona, underneath the offenses, these are children, and just that, children. And the sooner the village embraces its child, troubled or otherwise, maybe, just maybe, they might not have the urge to burn it down. Thank you. Any questions about youth justice? Remember, I've only been in the job for 8 months, so be nice.
Any questions?
Okay, that's
Yeah, we've got
question.
Okay.
But I just want to say that I'm a first year student, and there's a lot of negativity obviously fed into the profession, and every word you said then is just put me straight back into that positive feeling.
Well, thank you.
I've got a question. Mark, can I tell you the other way a bit? You mentioned the kind of multidisciplinary team and that you were sat next to a police officer. And certainly when I came to social work, we were kind of talking about radical social work and critiquing social work as soft policing. How do you kind of keep that distance between it being maybe seen as if we're working alongside the police, then are we soft police? How do you kind of try and deal with that fear?
I think what's important to accept, especially working in the setting I'm working, is that regardless of whether I sit next to him or not, they're going to court, they're going to get sentenced, and they're going to get punished. So what I can do as a social worker is just to try and make sure that whoever is going to sentence them realizes that this is their history, this is what they went through.
Yeah.
You know, it might have led to this, it might have led to that. Sitting alongside police officers is hard. They come from a very punitive background. But I think that is where we come out and shine as social workers and try and just fight for our values and fight for those kids in ways that you wouldn't be able to do if you sit in just a team full of social workers. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm saying this gives you the opportunity to sort of showcase the values of the profession to other professionals within a multi-agency setting.
That's really good. So yeah, Mark.
On average, how many social workers have the people you work with had before you?
How many, sorry?
How many social workers before you, the people that you work with, had before they've had you?
It just depends. Usually when they come in, they're looked after children, they're on child protection, so we're working with children's services as well. 90% of the children that come through our service, it's very rare to have them just come from a normal family background. I know I don't want to use normal family background because, everyone's reality is different, but we're getting children who are coming from single parents, households, who are coming from poverty, high poverty. They've been excluded from school, they've got mental health issues, they're looked after, they're living out of area. And in that environment, everybody's looking to send them to custody. And you are said there saying, no, we need to relook at this and see if this is the best way to rehabilitate this child. As a social worker in youth justice, I certainly do not wish to contribute to having prisons as positive places. But if they do have to go to custody, the least I can do is make it rewarding, or not even rewarding, I don't know how to put it, but make it the best that it can be for a child.
Okay, thank you, Yvonne.
Yes.
Wonderful, yeah, thank you.
So
Oh, we've got one more. Yeah, yes, last one.
So, one of the things awesome, really inspiring.
Thank
you so much. And it's excellent to have a national person sharing a national story, which is great. Thank you.
Thank you.
If there were 3 things that you would, the learning that we can take if you're in Coventry for our academy, what were the 3 things that you would say that we should be doing for newly qualified social workers?
I think the first thing I would say, because I was only a student not long ago myself, is to listen to students. Sometimes the environment, the power dynamics make it very difficult for students to say how they feel, and people just want to get through placement and qualify. But I believe it shouldn't be like that. If I say something that's controversial or unacceptable, I should be pulled aside. And then, you should be able to talk to me, not me being scared to ask something because I might then be kicked off the course and not qualify. I think the power dynamics are really, really precarious when you are a student. And I think if there's a student in this room, they will agree with that. That it's about putting your head down and getting through it. And Stephen and Genam will tell you that that's not what I did. That's not just who I am. I can't do that. But I do know my colleagues, they are not, probably in a position to challenge things, to challenge how things work in an organization. You usually get the answer that we've done it like this for 10 years, and then you just step aside. Just because, it's working, so why are you challenging it?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We've got one more, you're very popular. Nashua.
It's really, really quick, but it's so encouraging to hear about a social worker working in youth justice. In Basel, we've got a group of people who are interested in youth justice issues because we want to shine a spotlight on all the very different things that social workers do. Again, if we look at history, we've seen probation and social work work together at one point, and then they've departed, and not very good things have happened to probation. But if there are people in this room, including yourself, that would want to be part of this group, so that we've got a stronger voice, and it's the things that you're saying really about how you look at children in the youth justice system, and what is the added value that social work brings to youth justice. Just to say, so we have a group, and we want it to have more prominence and more influence in these issues. So that's all I wanted to add, really. But it's so great to hear what you're doing, so thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that's
Thank
great.
you.
Thanks very much. Yeah. Dr. Stephen Cowden now, the course director for the MA Social Work.
Do I need this, or is it better just talk like this? What's better?
Go with the mic.
Without?
Go with the mic. Yeah, go with the mic.
With?
Yeah. So Steve's background is mental health. He's been in the university about 15 years. And the rest he'll say for himself.
Let me just get this one. Is that okay? Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. First of all, it's lovely to speak to address an audience of commissioned social work and social work practitioners on International World Social Work Day. I think World Social Work Day is a fantastic event. It's great that we've got it. I think it's great to celebrate. I think we also need to look at some of the threats to social work. So I want to talk today about some of the organisational systems that have come into place. They're things that have been touched on by every speaker in different ways, but I think we need to actually properly address them if we're going to really understand what the issues facing social work are. And I just want to quote an article from The Guardian 2016. It's 6:30 a.m. and still dark, and Jeannie's setting out for her job as a home care worker. When she returns home in 12 hours' time, she will have made 23 house calls to sick and elderly people, driven 20 miles within appointments, and earned a grand total of £64.80 before tax. Along with her army of fellow car workers in this northern town, she is on a 0 hours contract and fears losing work if his employer is unhappy with her. She fears that speaking out about how she has to race between visits, cutting short her appointments in order to earn the, quote, national living wage, might result in an immediate loss of earnings. I think what we're talking about here is commodification, the commodification of so many aspects of the social work role. And what that involves, in case you haven't heard that term before, is giving every element of the social work service a unit cost. Now, I think one of the things that's happened here, and I think this is something that people have touched on in different ways, is that the social work role has been broken up into different components, often through outsourcing. And a lot of the cases I've had with students have talked about that in different ways. The experiences of the woman described here is just one aspect of those. By breaking social work up into these unit costs and focusing social work around the delivery of targets, we are undermining the social work role and its professional premises itself. Let's look at those sustainable development goals. If we think about the outsourcing of care work, we are not only not contributing those sustainable development goals, we're actively working against them. We're placing people on low wages, we're placing people, these people are part of the working poor, we're undermining gender equality. Most of these army of care workers are women. We're not creating decent work or economic growth. We're increasing inequalities. So we've got to see the connection between these sustainable goals and the actual organisational circumstances we find ourselves in. And it's crucial that we start to make these connections if we are to be true to what social work actually is and those kind of laudable goals that we have up here. I don't want to pour cold water on the fantastic work that Lee and Saab have just discussed, but let me say something controversial. I think we need to stop talking about resilience. I think we need to start talking about the way we have a state that is actively punishing the poor and vulnerable. And I think if we look at the treatment of people with disabilities, and Mark's described some of that this morning, if we look at the fact that they have constant changes of social work, if we look at the treatment of vulnerable older people who survey after survey has showed they are leaving our hospitals in malnourished, we have to ask ourselves how it is that this has happened. I think one of the things that we've created as well with the organisational culture that we're part of is that we have a service driven by targets, and that's undermined the professional roles. Nusra talked about probation. I'm old enough to remember that when you were able to, if you wanted to, when I trained, you could be a probation officer and you could be funded by the Home Office. Probation officer was a part of social work. It's now been outsourced into companies like G4S and Serco, looking after extremely vulnerable people. And that's the organisational cultures are what contributes to the kind of outcomes we have. And I think we need to start talking about those. Subject and Lee talked about burnout. Yeah? Why do we have such burnout in amongst our social workers? Why do our social workers stay with us for such a short period of time? I think we have to start talking about the conditions of work. Nusra referred to the kind of difficulties that our social workers face, the conditions of work people are under. Since the introduction of managerialism, research done by the trade union movement has illustrated an exponential increase in workplace bullying. Yeah? This is directly a result of commodification and a system driven by targets. And I think these are the key things we need to talk about. If we are to talk about the sustainable goals and what social work is all about, reducing inequality, supporting the vulnerable, we need to start talking about those things. Gurnham has told me I only had 7 minutes.
You can have a bit more. You can have a bit more.
I was as shocked by that as anything, because I hardly ever known Gurnham to do anything on time. But I'll just make one point before I finish. I think first of all, if we're talking about the conditions our social workers face, we have to talk about workloads. We have to talk about the conditions people face in work. We have to talk about bullying. And we have to talk about the forces that can counter that. And I think this is where trade unions play such an important role. We don't hear very much about the role of trade unions in ending poverty. But, you know, if you've got people having to do these kind of conditions that I described there, we've got some of our people performing key social work tasks living below the national wage. So trade unions play a crucially important role. I think this is where our educators need to be linked in and encouraging critical reflection not just critical reflection. And I was very disturbed by Nusra's research that showed social workers are not having time to critically reflect, because how can you do the job properly? But this isn't just a question of resilience, this is about people not having time. They're rushing between one thing to another, and all the other jobs they have to do on the computer, etc., etc. So I think we need to have a real discussion about these things. Yeah? What is social work for? Increasingly, we have a them and us mentality between service users. There was some research my MA students did last week that was comparing social work in Norway to social work in the UK, and the vast majority of social work service users in the UK said they did not like their social workers and did not welcome them. So I think we need to have a realistic discussion about these things. Yeah? I won't say any more, but thank you very much for listening to me.